The flood and the rescue, the storm that changed everything, rain hammered the thatched roofs of Thornwick Village with merciless fury. Celeste Morven pressed her face against the window of her master's apothecary, watching the Silvermere River swell beyond its banks. At 17 she had seen storms before, but nothing like this. The water churned brown and angry, swallowing the lower market district with terrifying speed. Her master, old Brennan the healer, stood beside her with worried eyes. The villagers trusted him with their ailments and injuries, and now they would need him more than ever. Celeste had apprenticed under him for 4 years, learning the properties of herbs, the setting of bones, and the delicate art of surgical stitching. She was good at her work, perhaps too good for someone so young, which often earned her suspicious glances from the more traditional villagers. Thunder cracked overhead, shaking the sturdy building. Through the sheets of rain, Celeste spotted movement near the collapsed bridge. Someone was out there struggling against the current. Without thinking, she grabbed her waterproof cloak and bolted for the door. Brennan shouted after her, but his words were lost in the storm's roar. Celeste plunged into the knee-deep water flooding the street, her boots immediately soaking through. The current pulled at her legs, trying to sweep her off balance. She steadied herself against a stone wall and pushed forward toward the desperate splashing she'd seen. But as she drew closer, she realized it wasn't a person at all. A creature of legend trapped beneath a fallen oak tree, partially submerged in the swirling floodwater, was a dragon. Not the massive, village-destroying beast from old tales, but a hatchling no larger than a hunting hound. Its scales gleamed deep crimson even in the gray stormlight, and one of its wings bent at an unnatural angle beneath the tree's weight. Celeste's breath caught. Dragons were real. The village elders spoke of them in hushed tones, remnants of an ancient time before the Great Separation when humans and dragons had warred until both sides agreed to live apart. For 300 years that treaty had held. Dragons kept to their mountain territories and humans stayed in their valleys and plains. Contact was forbidden, punishable by exile or worse. The creature's golden eyes locked onto hers, and she saw something there that struck her heart. Intelligence and pain. It made a sound, not quite a roar, more like a desperate plea. Its serpentine body shuddered as it tried and failed to free itself from the crushing weight of the oak. Celeste looked back toward the village. No one else had ventured out into the flood. No one else knew this creature was here, drowning slowly in rising water. She could walk away. She should walk away. The laws were clear, and she had worked too hard to build her reputation as a healer to throw it away on a forbidden act. The dragon whimpered, a heartbreaking sound that reminded her of an injured puppy she'd once nursed back to health. Her decision made itself. The act of mercy Celeste waded deeper into the current until she reached the fallen oak. The tree was massive, its trunk thick as a wagon wheel. She couldn't lift it alone, but perhaps she could shift it enough to free the trapped wing. She positioned herself, braced her feet against the muddy ground, and pushed with all her strength. The tree didn't budge. She tried again, her muscles screaming in protest. The dragon watched her efforts with those impossibly intelligent eyes, its breathing becoming more labored as water lapped higher against its scaled chest. Celeste refused to give up. She found a broken branch and wedged it beneath the tree, creating a makeshift lever. Using a rock as a fulcrum, she threw her full weight against the branch. With a groan of wood and a splash of displaced water, the tree shifted just enough. The dragon immediately pulled its wing free and scrambled toward higher ground, but it moved awkwardly, clearly injured. It couldn't fly, couldn't even climb properly. Celeste followed, her healer's instincts overriding everything else. She'd saved the creature from drowning, but it would die from its injuries if left untended. She caught up to it near an abandoned grain shed on the village's eastern edge, a structure the flood hadn't yet reached. The dragon turned to face her, and for a moment she wondered if she'd made a fatal mistake. Its jaws could snap her arm like kindling, but instead of attacking, it lowered its head and allowed her to approach. Forbidden healing, inside the shed. Away from the worst of the storm, Celeste examined the dragon by the light of a small oil lamp she'd found. The wing was dislocated, not broken, which meant she could set it. She'd done the same procedure on a hawk once, though this creature was considerably larger and more dangerous. She spoke softly as she worked, the same gentle tone she used with frightened patients. The dragon remained remarkably still, though she felt its muscles tense as she manipulated the wing joint back into place. It hissed but didn't snap at her. When she finished, She fashioned a splint from broken boards and strips of cloth torn from her underskirt, binding the wing close to the creature's body so it could heal properly. The dragon's scales felt warm beneath her fingers, almost hot, like sun-baked stones. Patterns of gold threaded through the crimson, forming intricate designs that seemed to shift when she wasn't looking directly at them. Beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, she cleaned and bandaged several deep lacerations along its flank, working by instinct and training. The dragon accepted her ministrations with surprising patience, occasionally making a low rumbling sound that might have been contentment or merely tolerance. As dawn broke and the storm finally began to ease, Celeste realized she'd spent the entire night with the creature. It had curled around her for warmth, its breathing deep and steady now that the pain had been dulled by the willow bark tincture she'd coaxed it to drink. She'd named it in her mind, Ember, for the way its scales glowed like dying coals in the lamplight. Discovery and departure. The sound of voices jolted Celeste awake. She dozed off against Ember's warm side, exhausted from the night's efforts. Now sunlight streamed through gaps in the shed's walls, and she could hear the village watch making their rounds, checking for flood damage. She tried to rouse Ember, to encourage the dragon to flee before they were discovered, but the creature's eyes were fever-bright. Infection had set into the deeper wounds despite her best efforts. Moving would be dangerous, possibly fatal. They needed more time. They didn't get it. The shed door burst open, revealing Thornwick's head elder, Gideon Blackwood, flanked by 3 armed guards. His face went from confusion to horror to rage in the span of a heartbeat. "Treachery," he bellowed. "The girl has broken the ancient laws." Celeste stood, placing herself between the guards and Ember. "It was injured and dying. I couldn't just leave it to drown." "It is a dragon." Gideon spat the word like a curse. "Our ancestors' blood was spilled by these monsters. The treaty exists for good reason. You have endangered us all with your foolish compassion." The guards raised their crossbows, but Celeste didn't move. Behind her, she felt Ember struggling to stand, to defend her despite its weakened state. The bond between them, formed in a single night of trust and care, felt stronger than any law written by frightened men centuries ago. But before the confrontation could escalate, something extraordinary happened. Ember lifted its head and released a sound unlike anything Celeste had heard before, a clear, resonant note that echoed across the valley like a bell. The guards faltered, their weapons lowering involuntarily. High overhead, shadows crossed the clearing sky. Celeste looked up to see 3 adult dragons circling, their massive forms blotting out the sun. They'd come for their lost hatchling. Gideon stumbled backward, his face ashen. The ancient treaty had a provision for this. If dragons came in peace to retrieve their young, humans were to allow it without conflict. To attack would restart the old wars. The largest dragon, its scales a deep burgundy shot through with veins of silver, landed with surprising gentleness near the shed. It approached Ember with obvious concern, sniffing and inspecting the bandages Celeste had applied. Then impossibly it turned its massive head toward her and bowed, a gesture of unmistakable respect and gratitude. Celeste felt tears streaming down her face without knowing when they'd started. Ember nuzzled against her one final time and she felt something pressed into her palm. A scale, still warm from the dragon's body, glowing with inner fire. Then the hatchling climbed onto its parent's back, and with a thunderous beat of wings, all 4 dragons launched skyward. She watched them disappear into the distance, her hand closed tightly around the scale. The villagers gathered around her, some angry, some afraid, all confused, but Celeste barely heard their arguments and accusations. Her heart had flown away with a crimson dragon who'd taught her that compassion was never a mistake, even when it broke every rule she'd been taught to follow. That night, the scale beneath her pillow glowed softly, and for the first time, Celeste dreamed of flying through star-filled skies on wings of fire. The years between. A new path, forward 15 years swept by like leaves carried on an autumn wind. Celeste Morven had left Thornwick Village not in exile, but by choice. The incident with Ember had marked her as different, touched by dragon magic, some whispered, while others called her reckless or mad. But Brennan had seen something else in her actions, a healer who would let no law stand between her and saving a life. He'd given her his blessing to travel, to take her skills beyond the narrow confines of village prejudice, Now at 32, Celeste had become something rare in the realm, a wandering healer with a reputation that preceded her. She traveled from settlement to settlement, mountain villages to coastal towns, treating anyone who needed help regardless of their ability to pay. The dragon scale remained her constant companion, tucked into a leather pouch she wore against her heart. It still glowed faintly in darkness, pulsing with a warmth that felt like a living heartbeat. Sometimes in her dreams she flew through crimson skies and heard a voice that spoke without words, filled with gratitude and promise. But today, her thoughts were elsewhere. She sat in the common room of the Wandering Crow Inn, reviewing her medical supplies while stealing glances at the man seated across from her. Dorian Ashford had joined her travels 3 months ago, and in that short time, he'd become as essential to her as the herbs in her healing bag. The scholar and the healer Dorian was tall and lean, with intelligent gray eyes that seemed to absorb everything around him. His dark hair constantly fell across his forehead, and he had an endearing habit of pushing it back whenever he became excited about a topic. He'd been studying ancient texts in a monastery when they'd met, researching the lost history of human and dragon relations before the Great Separation. Their meeting had been pure chance, or perhaps fate. Celeste had been called to treat a monk suffering from fever, and Dorian had assisted her, his careful hands and quick mind impressing her immediately, when he'd learned she was the girl from Thornwick, the one who'd saved a dragon hatchling. His scholarly interest had transformed into something deeper, fascination mixed with admiration. "Listen to this," Dorian said now, looking up from the leather-bound journal he'd been studying. His voice carried the enthusiasm of someone who'd just uncovered a precious secret. Before the Great Separation, there were humans called dragon speakers. They acted as bridges between the two species, resolving conflicts and facilitating cooperation. Celeste set down the bundle of feverfew she'd been sorting. "I thought that was just legend." "So did I until I found this account." He moved to sit beside her and she caught the scent of old paper and pine that always clung to him. A dragon speaker named Rosalind Thorne prevented a war single-handedly by healing a dragon prince who'd been poisoned. The dragons were so grateful they named her the first Sky Sovereign, giving her authority to speak for both species. His hand brushed hers as he pointed to a passage in the text, and Celeste felt the familiar flutter in her chest that had been growing stronger each day they spent together. She'd tried to resist the feeling at first, knowing that attachments made her traveling life complicated. But Dorian had worn down her defenses with his gentle humor, his genuine kindness, and the way he looked at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. "Do you think that's why they bowed to you?" he asked softly. "The adult dragons, I mean. Maybe they recognized something in what you did." Celeste touched the pouch at her heart. "I just did what any healer would do." "No." Dorian turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "You did what any person with true compassion would do. Laws and consequences be damned." "That's rare, Celeste. Rarer than you know." The intensity in his gaze made her breath catch. They'd been dancing around their feelings for weeks, both too cautious or perhaps too afraid to speak plainly. But something in this moment felt different, charged with possibility. Love under starlight that evening. They made camp in a meadow overlooking the Silver Lake, a vast body of water that reflected the sunset like molten gold. Celeste prepared a simple meal while Dorian set up their tent and built a fire. They'd fallen into these comfortable rhythms, working in harmony as if they'd traveled together for years instead of months. After dinner, they sat by the fire, watching stars emerge in the darkening sky. Dorian had been quieter than usual, and Celeste sensed something weighing on his mind. "There's something I need to tell you," he finally said, his voice barely audible above the crackling flames. "I wasn't entirely honest about why I joined your travels." Celeste's heart sank. She'd known it was too good to be true. This companionship, this growing warmth between them. "Go on." "I told you I wanted to study dragon lore, and that's true. But the real reason I left the monastery was because I couldn't stop thinking about you after you left." He turned to face her, his eyes reflecting firelight. "I'd read accounts of the Thornwick incident, heard the rumors. When I met you in person and realized you were everything I'd imagined and more, I knew I couldn't let you walk away." Relief flooded through her, followed by a warmth that had nothing to do with the fire. "You could have just asked to come along. And risk you saying no?" A smile tugged at his lips. I thought scholarly interest would be harder to refuse. Celeste laughed, the sound carrying across the still water. You're terrible at deception, Dorian Ashford. I knew you were interested in more than just old manuscripts within a week of traveling together. Was I that obvious? Completely. She moved closer, closing the distance between them on the log they shared. But I didn't mind. In fact, I was hoping you'd eventually work up the courage to say something. His hand found hers, fingers intertwining with a naturalness that felt like coming home. I love you, Celeste. I think I have since I first saw you treat that monk with such gentle efficiency, barking orders like a general while your hands worked miracles. You're brilliant and brave and stubborn, and I want to spend every day learning new things to admire about you. Tears pricked at Celeste's eyes. She'd been alone for so long, choosing solitude over the risk of losing someone. But Dorian had slipped past her defenses, and now she couldn't imagine traveling without his steady presence beside her. I love you too, she whispered, even though you snore and constantly lose your reading spectacles and insist on documenting everything in that journal, instead of just experiencing moments as they happen. He laughed, pulling her close. I don't snore. You absolutely do. Their first kiss tasted of smoke and promise, gentle and searching. When they finally pulled apart, the stars had multiplied overhead, a canopy of light bearing witness to their declaration. Omens and proposals, the next 3 months were the happiest of Celeste's life. She and Dorian traveled the realm as partners in every sense, treating the sick while gathering accounts of dragon sightings that had been increasing across the land. Farmers reported seeing shadows pass overhead at night. Shepherds found mysterious burn patterns in meadows, perfect circles that glowed faintly in darkness. Children claimed to hear singing on the wind, wordless melodies that made them dream of flying. Something was building, some great change approaching like a distant storm. Celeste felt it in the way her dragon scale grew warmer each day, pulsing with increased urgency. Her dreams became more vivid, crimson wings against golden skies, a voice calling her name in a language she'd never learned but somehow understood. Dorian documented everything with scholarly precision. But even his rational mind couldn't deny the pattern emerging. Dragons were moving, gathering somewhere in the northern mountains beyond mapped territories. The question was why and whether it posed a threat to human settlements. One evening, as autumn painted the world in shades of amber and rust, they camped beside an ancient standing stone covered in weathered carvings. Dorian had been studying the markings for hours, his excitement building as he deciphered their meaning. Celeste, these aren't random decorations, he called to her. They're a map, a route to something called the Dragon's Heart, a place where the sky touches stone. She joined him, running her fingers over the carved symbols. They were old, older than the Great Separation, perhaps older than human memory, and they were warm beneath her touch, responding to her presence in a way that made her scale burn hot against her chest. I think we need to follow this map, Dorian said quietly. That would take us into dragon territory. No human has crossed those borders in centuries. No human except you. He took both her hands in his expression serious and tender at once. Celeste, I believe you were meant for something extraordinary. That dragon you saved 15 years ago set something in motion, and it's coming to fruition now. Whatever's happening in the north, you're connected to it. She wanted to protest, to say she was just a healer who'd made an impulsive choice long ago. But deep down she knew he was right. The pull northward had been growing stronger, an undeniable summons she could no longer ignore. Dorian dropped to one knee, still holding her hands. Before we face whatever awaits us, I need to ask you something. Celeste Morven, will you marry me? Will you let me stand beside you? Not as a scholar studying history, but as your partner in writing it. Through tears of joy, Celeste pulled him to his feet and kissed him with all the love and fear and hope swirling in her heart. Yes, 1,000 times yes. They spent that night wrapped in each other's arms beneath the standing stone, making promises and plans for a future that felt both certain and impossibly uncertain. The stone hummed softly around them, its ancient magic recognizing the bond being forged. And high overhead, unseen in the darkness, a crimson shape circled once before winging northward, carrying news of the dragon speaker's readiness. The northern call, the message arrived at dawn, delivered by a young rider whose horse was lathered with foam from hard travel. The King's Council requested Celeste's presence immediately. Dragon activity had intensified near the northern border, and they needed her expertise as the only human in living memory to have peaceful contact with dragons. Dorian helped her pack, his hands steady though she could see worry in his eyes. "We'll go together," he said firmly. "Whatever happens, we face it side by side." They reached the capital city of Highcrest within a week, riding hard through increasingly cold weather. The northern mountains loomed on the horizon, their peaks wreathed in unusual cloud formations that moved against the wind. Celeste's scale had grown so hot she had to wrap it in cloth to keep it from burning her skin. The King's Council met in a circular chamber dominated by maps and military reports. Celeste and Dorian stood before 12 counselors, men and women whose faces reflected varying degrees of fear and suspicion. "We've counted over 200 dragons gathering in the Blackspire Mountains," explained Counselor Reese, a grizzled military commander. "They've made no aggressive moves, but their presence violates the treaty. We're considering preemptive action." "No," Celeste said sharply. "You'll start a war we cannot win." "Then what do you suggest?" challenged Counselor Meredith, a sharp-faced woman who'd never hidden her disdain for Celeste's unorthodox reputation. "We simply wait for them to attack?" "They're not going to attack." Celeste pulled out her dragon scale, letting it catch the lamplight. "They're waiting for something. Or someone." As if in response to her words, the scale flared bright enough to illuminate the entire chamber. A sound like distant bells echoed through the room, though no bells were ringing. Every person present felt it, a summons clear and undeniable. Dorian squeezed her hand. "It's time." The council erupted into argument, but Celeste barely heard them. The pull northward had become irresistible, a tide she could no more fight than stop the sun from rising. She looked at Dorian, seeing her own determination reflected in his eyes. "I'm going to the mountains," she announced, her voice cutting through the chaos. "Alone if I must, but I'd prefer to go with the council's blessing and a small escort." After heated debate, they agreed. Celeste, Dorian, and 5 guards would journey to Blackspire, carrying messages of peace but prepared for the worst. They would leave at first light, riding toward whatever destiny awaited in the dragon-haunted peaks. That night, Celeste dreamed more vividly than ever. She saw Ember, massive and magnificent, waiting at the heart of a vast volcanic crater. She saw hundreds of dragons assembled in judgment or celebration, she couldn't tell which. And she heard a voice, warm and familiar despite 15 years of silence, speaking a single word that echoed through her soul. "Come." The coronation of Sky Journey to the Dragon's Heart, the path to Blackspire Mountains grew steeper with each passing mile. Celeste rode at the front of their small party with Dorian close beside her, and 5 guards trailing watchfully behind. The air grew thin and cold, their breath forming clouds that dissipated slowly in the still morning light. They'd been climbing for 3 days, following the route marked on the ancient standing stone. The landscape had transformed from rolling hills to jagged cliffs, from autumn forests to barren stone. No birds sang here. No animals rustled in the sparse vegetation. It was as if they'd crossed into a realm where only dragons dared dwell. The guards grew increasingly nervous as dragon shadows passed overhead with growing frequency. Captain Thorne, a weathered veteran with more scars than smiles, kept his hand on his sword hilt constantly. "I don't like this," he muttered. "We're exposed, vulnerable. One strafing run and we're ash." "They won't attack," Celeste said with more confidence than she felt. Her dragon scale had grown so hot, she'd had to store it in a metal box lined with wet cloth. Even contained, she could feel its pulse matching her heartbeat, growing faster as they ascended. Dorian consulted his maps and journals, though they had long since passed beyond any charted territory. According to the old texts, the Dragon's Heart is a volcanic crater at the mountain's peak. It was considered sacred ground, a place where the barrier between sky and earth grew thin. "Sacred to dragons or humans?" asked Lieutenant Fenna, the youngest of their guards. "Both originally." Dorian looked up at the circling shadows. Before the Great Separation, it was where dragon speakers would meet with dragon councils to negotiate peace and resolve disputes. As they rounded a steep switchback, the path opened onto a plateau. Before them stretched a sight that stole Celeste's breath. A massive volcanic crater, easily a mile across, its interior terraced with natural stone formations that created a vast amphitheater. And filling every available surface perched on ledges and gathered on the crater floor were dragons, hundreds of them, perhaps thousands, dragons of every color imaginable, crimson and gold, sapphire and emerald, midnight black and pearl white. They ranged from hatchlings no bigger than cats to ancient worms whose wingspans could shadow entire villages, and every single one of them had turned to watch the approaching humans. Captain Thorne drew his sword with a metallic rasp. "Gods preserve us." "Put that away," Celeste commanded, her voice sharp. "We came in peace. We'll behave peacefully." The captain hesitated, then reluctantly sheathed his blade. The party stood frozen at the crater's edge, tiny and insignificant before the assembled might of dragonkind. One blast of fire, one coordinated attack, and they would be erased from existence. Instead, the dragons parted, creating a clear path down into the crater's heart. Recognition and revelation, Celeste dismounted, her legs trembling slightly. Dorian was immediately at her side, taking her hand. "Together," he reminded her softly. They walked forward, leaving their nervous guards and horses behind. Each step felt monumental, as if she were crossing not just physical distance but some invisible threshold between worlds. The dragons watched in absolute silence, thousands of eyes tracking their progress. At the crater's center stood a raised platform of smooth black stone, volcanic glass that reflected the sky like dark water. And waiting on that platform was Ember. Celeste would have known him anywhere, despite the 15 years that had transformed an injured hatchling into a magnificent adult dragon. He stood nearly 30 feet tall. His crimson scales shot through with veins of gold that pulsed with inner light. His wings, fully healed and powerful, were folded against his sides. The patterns she'd noticed long ago now covered his entire body, intricate geometric designs that seemed to shift and flow like living script. Their eyes met, and Celeste felt the connection that had formed that storm-soaked night in Thornwick snap back into place, stronger than ever. Joy, gratitude, affection, and something deeper than friendship flooded through her. "Emotions too vast for words. You came," Ember said. And though his mouth didn't form human sounds, Celeste heard him clearly in her mind, his voice warm and slightly amused. "I knew you would, my savior, my friend." Celeste found her voice, though tears streamed freely down her face. "I never forgot you. Not a single day. Nor I you." Ember lowered his massive head until his snout nearly touched her outstretched hand. "I have waited 15 years to thank you properly. To show you what your kindness meant, not just to me, but to all dragons." An enormous dragon, ancient beyond measure, descended from the highest terrace. Its scales were deep burgundy, the same coloring as the adult who'd retrieved Ember all those years ago. Power radiated from it like heat from a forge, and when it spoke, every dragon and both humans felt the words resonate in their bones. "I am Crimsonwing, elder of the mountain clans and mother to the one you call Ember." The ancient dragon's voice was feminine, rich with age and wisdom. 15 years ago, you saved my son when you had every reason to leave him to his fate. You broke your laws to honor the higher law of compassion. You risked your safety for a creature your people fear and hate. Celeste felt Dorian's supportive presence beside her, drawing strength from him. He was hurt and scared. "I couldn't leave him to die. Many could. Many have." Crimsonwing's eyes, golden and ancient, fixed on her with penetrating intensity. "But you, Celeste Morven, proved what we had hoped. That humans still carry within them the capacity for true kinship across species." Another dragon emerged from the assembled crowd, this one silver-scaled with eyes like polished steel. "I am Starweaver, keeper of ancient memories. Let me show you the truth we have hidden for 3 centuries. The air shimmered, and suddenly Celeste saw visions, memories not her own. She watched the great separation unfold, a war sparked not by inevitable conflict but by a terrible misunderstanding, manipulated by those who profited from fear and division. She saw dragon speakers murdered by extremists on both sides who wanted permanent separation. She witnessed the treaty being signed in grief and exhaustion, both species retreating to lick their wounds and nurse their hatred. But she also saw hope. Dragons watching humanity from afar, waiting for signs that the old wounds might heal, waiting for someone to prove that compassion could bridge the gulf of fear. "You were the sign we needed," Starweaver continued. "Your act of mercy convinced the dragon councils to attempt reconciliation. But reconciliation requires a bridge, someone who can speak for both species, who understands both hearts." Celeste's mind reeled. "You want me to be a dragon speaker?" Like in the old stories. More than that. Ember moved closer, his warmth enveloping her like a gentle embrace. We want you to be what Rosalind Thorne once was. The Sky Sovereign, the voice between worlds. Not a ruler but a mediator, a protector, a symbol of what's possible when fear is set aside. The crown of fire and trust. Dorian stepped forward, his scholar's mind processing rapidly. The old text said the Sky Sovereign was chosen by both dragons and humans. Celeste has clearly earned dragon trust, but will humans accept this? Many still see dragons as enemies or monsters. Crimson Wing's laugh rumbled like distant thunder. Wise words from the scholar who loves her. You are correct. This will not be easy. That is why we do not ask Celeste to stand alone. She will need advisors, allies, and a consort who understands both worlds as she does. The ancient dragon turned her gaze to Dorian, and he felt the weight of that assessment. You have studied our history when most humans prefer to forget. You have traveled beside Celeste with loyalty and love. You have proven yourself worthy to stand at her side if she will have you. Celeste turned to Dorian, seeing her own wonder and fear reflected in his face. You'd do this? Give up your quiet, scholarly life to help me bridge two worlds that have been enemies for centuries? He cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away her tears. I'd follow you into dragonfire if you asked. This is just slightly less dramatic. His smile turned serious. Besides, someone needs to document this properly for future historians. Despite everything, Celeste laughed. She looked around at the assembled dragons, at the impossible responsibility being offered to her, and felt the dragon scale burning hot against her heart, even through its metal container. This was why Ember had come into her life. This was the purpose that had been pulling her northward. I accept, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the crater. I'll serve as Sky Sovereign, as a bridge between dragons and humans, with Dorian Ashford as my consort and advisor. The dragon's response was immediate and overwhelming. Every creature present raised their voice in a harmonic chord that shook the mountain itself. Fire bloomed in the sky. Not destructive but celebratory, colors weaving together in patterns of incredible beauty. Ember approached, carrying something in his claws. A circlet woven from dragon scales of every color, held together by strands of pure gold that seemed to flow like liquid. This was the crown worn by the last Sky Sovereign, preserved for 300 years in hope that another worthy would emerge. It is not a symbol of power over others, but of responsibility to all. Celeste knelt, and Ember placed the crown upon her head. The scales immediately warmed, conforming to her as if they'd been made specifically for her. Power flowed through her, not the crushing weight of authority, but the energizing current of purpose and connection. She felt linked suddenly to every dragon in the crater, able to sense their emotions and thoughts if she focused. More remarkably, she understood their language perfectly now, heard the nuances in their harmonic communications that had been mere noise before, and when she spoke, her words translated seamlessly, audible to both human and dragon ears. I, Celeste Morven, accept the crown of Sky Sovereign, she said formally, the words coming from some deep instinct. I swear to serve both species with fairness and compassion, to seek peace before conflict, and to never forget that every life, whether scaled or skinned, matters equally. Crimson Wing spread her massive wings, witnessed and accepted by the dragon councils. Let the news spread. The Sky Sovereign has returned, and with her comes the possibility of a new age. A new beginning. The ceremony continued for hours, with dragons from every clan coming forward to acknowledge the new Sky Sovereign. They brought gifts, scales for wisdom, crystals for clarity, rare herbs for healing. Dorian stood beside Celeste throughout, his presence grounding her when the magnitude of what she'd agreed to threatened to overwhelm her. Finally, as the sun began to set, painting the crater in shades of gold and crimson that matched Ember's scales, Crimson Wing addressed the assembly once more. The Sky Sovereign must have a seat of power, a place where both humans and dragons can meet safely. We propose the establishment of Sky's Edge, a settlement to be built here at the crater's rim. It will be neutral ground, protected by dragon might and human law, where the future of both species can be negotiated and shaped. The 5 guards who'd accompanied Celeste had watched everything from the crater's edge, their faces cycling through terror, awe, and finally cautious hope. Captain Thorne stepped forward now, saluting with more respect than he'd shown upon their departure. Your Majesty, he said, testing out the title. The King's Council will need convincing. Many humans still fear dragons. Then we'll convince them, Celeste replied, feeling more confident than she had any right to feel. Not through force or threats, but through actions. We'll open trade, share knowledge, and prove that cooperation benefits everyone. Ember moved closer, his presence protective and proud. I will serve as your primary liaison to the Dragon Councils, as is my right and honor. The one you saved will help you save both our peoples. As darkness fell, the dragons illuminated the crater with controlled fire, creating a light show of breathtaking beauty. Celeste stood at the center of it all, Dorian's hand in hers, the crown warm upon her head, and felt the weight of destiny settling onto her shoulders. It would not be easy. There would be resistance from humans who clung to old fears and dragons who remembered old wounds. There would be setbacks and conflicts, misunderstandings and mistakes. But for the first time in 3 centuries, there was hope. A girl's act of kindness performed without thought for reward or recognition had saved a dragon. Now, decades later, that dragon had crowned her queen of the skies. Not as a ruler, but as a bridge. And together, human and dragon would write a new chapter in their shared history. Ember curled around Celeste and Dorian protectively, his warmth keeping the mountain cold at bay. Thank you, he said softly, his voice filled with emotion, for saving me then, and for saving all of us now. Celeste leaned against his scaled side, feeling Dorian's arm around her waist. She thought of the frightened girl who'd waded into floodwaters 15 years ago, driven by nothing more than an inability to let a creature suffer. She'd had no idea that one choice would lead to this moment, to this impossible responsibility and this magnificent honor. No, she said, looking up at the stars emerging overhead, at the dragons whose fires illuminated the darkness. Thank you for giving me the chance to prove that kindness is never wasted, and that bridges can be built even across the deepest divides. Above them, dragons wheeled and danced through the night sky, their joyous cries echoing across the mountains. And in settlements far below, humans looked up in wonder at the lights blazing in the Black Spire peaks, whispering to each other that perhaps the old stories of dragon speakers and sky sovereigns had been true after all. A new era had begun, born from compassion and crowned in fire, and at its heart stood Celeste Morven, healer and bridge, beloved of a dragon and devoted to a scholar wearing a crown woven from scales and responsibility. The Queen of the Skies who would spend her life ensuring that the gap between earth and heaven, between human and dragon, would never widen beyond crossing again. The story of separation had ended. The story of reunion was just beginning. Sonnet 4.5